There we are. Hello. We just need your sound. Your sound's off.
All right, how's that?
Good, perfect.
Okay, I'm so sorry to be slow. I was running my dog all over the place, and yeah. So
I'm at the gym where my daughter's in gymnastics, so I'm very, I can see what she's doing. So we're like in the same place. You missed my introduction, so I did introduce you just to let people know who you were. I think most people here know who you are, actually. I don't know, is there anything else you feel you need to say or add? Okay, I did let everybody know you just got back from Rwanda, and so that's kind of our focus here. I don't know if you want to give a brief history first. Really, we kind of want to focus on reconciliation and what's going on right now with those efforts and what you saw, because I know this isn't your area of expertise, but you were there. So yeah, maybe just start with like a brief history, and then kind of just your experiences there and what it looks like now, what they're doing now.
Sure. Yeah, so it's good to see you again. Sorry for being late. Sorry to keep you all waiting, and thanks for having me. Really glad to be with this group. So yeah, let me just share a little bit of my experience and what I saw and just was so impressed with, and of course it's such a unique experience of what Rwanda went through and has gone through over the past 30 years. So it's not nothing that we want to replicate because we don't want to replicate the depth and the scope of suffering that happened there. But I think there are some really inspiring and instructive things that are happening there. So most of you, if not all of you, will know and remember that 30 years ago, Rwanda went through a genocide of the Hutus against the Tutsis, these two ethnic groups, in which 1 million people were killed in the space of 100 days. I mean, it's staggering to think about. 1 million people in the space of 100 days. And it is the largest genocide since World War II, since the Holocaust. It's also, as far as we know in recorded history, the fastest or most efficient genocide in terms of killing that many people in that condensed of a period of time. So maybe I'll just talk a little bit about the background of what happened that led to 1994, because I think that's instructive too, because it didn't come out of nowhere. It did not happen in a vacuum, but that also helps to inform the shape of the reconciliation efforts that have taken place since then. So Rwanda, if you're not familiar, so it's one of the smaller countries in Africa. It's in Eastern Central Africa. Just south of Uganda, east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, west of Tanzania. It was one of, if not the last, it was one of the last African nations that Europeans discovered, quote unquote. The Rwandans didn't need to be discovered; they knew they were there the whole time. But it was one of the last places that the Europeans came to. And therefore one of the last ones that was colonized by Europeans as well. It was colonized by the Belgians. None of the European colonial authorities were terrific, but the Belgians were particularly bad, especially what they did in the Congo. And by the time they came to Rwanda, they essentially landed upon kind of a divide and conquer strategy to divide the population against itself. Rwanda had actually, it's one of the smallest African countries even today. It's also one of the most densely populated. It is the most densely populated country in Africa. And it was true that was true at the time as well, in the late 19th century. And it's an extremely mountainous and beautiful, gorgeous country. Now it's known, you can go see silverback gorillas there and things like that. It's one of the only places where there's gorillas in their native habitat. So this incredibly beautiful, but in some ways also remote country. So the Belgians came to it in the late 19th century, and they what they did is they essentially created these two groups, Hutus and Tutsis. Before this, Rwanda had been actually a very unified country, had been under a single monarchy, spoke as a single language. So you didn't have some of the divisions that we see in other African nations and others. It was actually a fairly unified place. Not that it was perfect or entirely peaceful, or, you know, we don't need to romanticize the pre-colonial past, but it was unified. That's the point. And the Belgians came in, and in order to manipulate the people and to set some against others, they essentially created these two groups, Hutus and Tutsis. And the way that they decided this, again, it wasn't based on language. They all spoke the same language. It wasn't based on religion. The whole country eventually converts to Catholicism and other forms of Christianity. It was based on class, and it was made up. Basically, what they said is, if you have 10 cows or more, you're a Tutsi. If you have less than 10 cows, you're a Hutu. And so it was class-based. Well, obviously that meant that the elites were the Tutsis, and the vast majority of the population was Hutu. And then they came up with all kinds of reasons to then justify that. They said, oh, that the Hutus, that they were descended from Ham, that they were agriculturalists. The Tutsis actually, they had thinner noses and lighter skin and longer features. They must have had more interaction with Northern Africa and so forth. And so they were more from Shem. So they used the Bible to justify some of this. They used science to justify this. They were measuring people's noses and foreheads and all kinds of things to justify these creation of these ethnic groups. So while the Belgians were in power, they used the Tutsis as their governing elite, which of course created a lot of resentment among the Hutus. And then, so if we fast forward to when Rwanda gets its independence in 1959, the majority Hutus overthrew Belgian rule, and also meant that they overthrew the Tutsis, who were collaborators in that colonial regime. And so you had these decades of pent-up resentment of Hutus against Tutsis, that at this point, they believed that it was real, right? Even though it had only been made up a few decades before by the colonial administrators. By the 1950s, they thought it was real. They all carried ID cards that told them they were Hutu or that they were Tutsi. They had bought into some of these myths. And so beginning in 1959, you have periodic violent outbursts by now the new Hutu majority who controls the government against the Tutsi minority. Tutsis were about 15% of the population. And these were periodic, they were sporadic, they were quite violent, but they were usually somewhat contained until 1994. So there was a government in power. The party had become, it was basically a one-party state. And it revolved around what they called Hutu power. They said these Tutsis have been a thorn in our side for too long. They blamed all of their problems on the Tutsis. Over the decades, they had developed dehumanizing rhetoric. They especially called Tutsis cockroaches. They say we have these cockroaches who have infested our homes, our country, our nation. And we can't thrive, we can't be healthy so long as we have this cockroach infestation. So what do you do when your house is infested with cockroaches? Well, you can't just live with the cockroaches. You have to drive the cockroaches out. You have to exterminate the cockroaches. So they had been developing this for years, these ideas that were distributed with print on the newspapers, with radio stations. And again, this is centralized within the government. There's other things going on regionally and so forth. It's complex, but long story short, in early April 1994, a plane carrying the president of Rwanda, who was himself a Hutu power politician, it was shot down. And still to this day, nobody knows who shot it down. There's lots of theories. There's plausible theories as to why different groups would have wanted that to happen. Long story short, the president's plane is shot down and he's killed. And immediately that night, There's essentially kind of a coup. The generals and the other Hutu power leaders take over, and they call for, they say the time has come. They've been building up to this. They've literally been arming people with machetes and other things. And they said, now is the time, the cockroaches have attacked. Now is the time. We have to exterminate them. We can't abide with this any longer. And so they went for 100 days doing this. Most of the killing was done hand to hand. Most of it was done by machete. That there were some people killed by bullets and so forth, but most of it was done with machetes, with garden implements. It was neighbors killing neighbors. It was people. Most people knew their killers because it was all very localized. And just no mercy to women, to children, to the elderly, and just the most horrific things you can imagine. There was an international presence there that the UN had been observing, some peace talks that had been taking place. So there was a UN presence. But this is, if you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, it actually depicts this pretty well in terms of basically the international community just turning their back on Rwanda. They knew exactly what was happening. They could have stopped it with actually a very modest use of force, and they chose not to. Instead, they evacuated all the Europeans, all of the Americans, all of the foreign nationals, and left the Rwandans to themselves. And which is exactly what the Hutu power people had planned on and schemed. They had counted on the international community and on whites not caring what Black Africans do to each other. So that's exactly what happened. And for 100 days, the killing went on. And then finally, there was an army of expatriate Tutsis who were in Uganda and in some of the other surrounding countries. They came in. It's called the Rwandan Patriotic Front. They invaded the country, defeated the Hutus, took over, and that ended the genocide. So basically then the Hutu government was now replaced by this new Tutsi government, by this invading army. And it was led largely by a guy named Paul Kagame, who quickly became the president of the country. He's still the president of the country. So they have, and basically he has said, we need to focus on unity. So we're not going to allow for all the kinds of things that divide a society, like democratic politics and a free press and free speech. And so Kagame is still president 30 years later. While we were there, actually, they had the presidential elections. Some of his rivals had been thrown into prison and so forth, and he won with 99.18% of the vote. And so Kagame will remain as president for another several years. So that kind of gives you kind of the political background. So let me just say a few things about what they did after 1994. So and I think this is actually pretty remarkable. So whatever you think about Kagame over the 30 years and not relinquishing power and so forth. So these are complicated stories, especially on a kind of political level. But almost immediately they realized, we still have to live with each other here. So, a million Tutsis had been killed, but still some remained. And then there were all these refugees and others who came back into the country. And so still it was there was nobody in the country who was untouched by the violence, either because they'd been a victim, they were a survivor, they were a relative of a victim or a survivor, or they were a perpetrator, or they were a relative of a perpetrator. Literally nobody. It's such a small country. The violence was so extensive that literally nobody was untouched. Nobody could say my hands are totally clean. And so they had to think about, how do you deal with that? They realized very quickly that there were so many perpetrators that if they used kind of Western style traditional justice, trials and all of those kinds of things, that literally, first of all, there would be no room in the jails for all the perpetrators. They couldn't build enough jails for them. And second of all, literally they would still be, I mean, we talked to people and they said we would still be doing trials today 30 years later, right? I mean, just the capacity, you know, to go through that many, you know, and so they realized very quickly that we can't do that. And also we're still here living together. Again, it's so densely populated. It's not like you can just like separate and be on your own, you know, like send somebody to time out or something like that. I mean, people, it's just live cheek to jowl. And so, so it was really kind of necessity is the mother of invention. And they also, you know, they had other models available to them, you know, so again, they knew about the Nuremberg trials after World War II. And again, they said, again, there's too many perpetrators. The Nuremberg trials really focused on the elites. And they said, you know, we have so many hundreds of thousands of perpetrators here. So that wasn't a good model. They looked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which was ongoing at the time. And they were inspired by a lot of that. But they also, there have been criticisms of the TRC as well, that it let people off too easy if they simply admitted what they did, that it didn't necessarily reach down all the way into the communities. It was a little bit too top down. And so they recognized some of the virtues of the TRC, but they said, you know, we maybe have to go a different way. And so what they did is actually they leaned back into their own history. They reached back into their own traditional communal ways of doing justice at the village level. And they created these things called gacaca courts. And gacaca just meant like that they were meeting outside. So literally they would meet outside, you know, under the shade of a tree or under some kind of awning or something like this. And it was done entirely at a community level, entirely at a village level. And they would bring perpetrators. Again, nobody was anonymous in this. Everybody knew who the perpetrators were, right? And so perpetrators would come before these gacaca courts or be brought before these gacaca courts. And the deal was that they would admit to what they had done. And then they would point out where the bodies were, literally say where the bodies were buried so that people could identify and bury their kin and their friends. And then they would, and then the community would decide what to do with these people. And they had the full range of options available to them. They could imprison them or not. They could do all kinds of things. It's really interesting. 70% of these gacaca courts were led by women. So this was very much a woman-led process. And basically the spirit of these gacaca courts was, how do we find a way to balance accountability and justice with the recognition that we have to live together and we have to find a new way forward. And so those perpetrators who had, there were sort of four categories. Those who were really the kind of architects of the genocide, really the elites, they were dealt with in international tribunals or tribunals at the national level. So they were dealt with there. That was not really done at the community level. Those who had done violence basically just against property, maybe stolen some stuff or alluded to some things or other things, they came and confessed their crimes, but basically they were let off. It's kind of like, we don't have time to deal with you, right? Those who were low-level perpetrators, oftentimes, and low level in this case means that maybe they killed only a couple of people or something like this. They were oftentimes assigned some form of community service. And actually the really beautiful part here is they really had a sense of restorative justice. The sense, you know, there were all these widows, all these people whose homes had been destroyed, all these orphans whose parents had been lost. And these gacaca courts would oftentimes say, okay, the way that you will pay for what you did is you will rebuild this widow's home, or you will take care of these children. You will be now responsible for these children. You will, you know, you will do this farming and you will support this widow and these children. So the kind of a variety of creative ways to take care of the survivors. And then those who were major perpetrators oftentimes were imprisoned, but usually not longer than 8 years. Again, this was not the idea of like throw them in jail and throw away the key. It was, how do we rebuild a society? So even those who killed many, many people, most of them received maximum 8-year prison sentence if they admitted to what they had done. So it's really interesting how they dealt with that, really at a local level, just thinking creatively about like what is needed, what do we need to heal, what can we do for one another, and what does it mean to live together. The other thing, and I'll just mention a couple of other things, and then we can just open it up for conversation and Q&A. But one of the things the government did, which was really interesting, is they created a series of what they called reconciliation villages. So again, keep in mind that lots of people lost their homes, lots of people's property was destroyed, and so the government and the government did not want to. It wanted to instill a sense of unity among the population rather than segregating perpetrators from victims and survivors. So what they did is they created these reconciliation villages in which, and this was led by the government, also with some international funding. The international community was pretty guilty and felt pretty guilty about abandoning Rwanda in its time of need. So there has been a fair number of resources come in from the international community since then to support some of these efforts. But they created these villages, and the idea is that in these villages, you would have both perpetrators and survivors living together. The the government would provide it a home and a small farm or a garden or some other means of subsistence for widows and other survivors. They would also provide these homes for perpetrators, former perpetrators, if they promised to come and live in peace, again, admit what they had done. Some of them served, again, some of these prison sentences and then came back to these communities. But the idea is that the government would provide them with homes if they would live together, survivors and perpetrators next to each other. I mean, can you imagine, right? I think it's the most remarkable experiment in social reconciliation that we know of in the model. I don't know of anything more remarkable, especially at the community level, at the village level. There's a lot of great peace processes and other things that have helped to tamp down violence and so forth. But at really the community level, this experiment of can survivors and former perpetrators live together? Can they forgive one another? Now, nobody was forced to forgive, but the idea is simply just you wouldn't take vengeance against that you would live in peace and basically figure it out. And so we went to one of these reconciliation villages. I should say I was there as part of a Utah State University study abroad trip. So I was there with about 10 students and a handful of other adults. And so we went and visited a number of these places. And we went to one of these reconciliation villages and we were greeted by the elders. I mean, it would have been just like it was in a gacaca court. We were sitting out in the open air, just under the trees and under this kind of shaded canopy. Very kind of traditional African greetings and so forth. And then they had two members of the community, this man and this woman, speak to us. And the woman was a survivor. Her name was Cecile. She had lost her entire family. Her husband and all of her children were killed in the genocide. She lost her home. She lost everything. And so when the opportunity came to move into this reconciliation village, she admitted, she said, I didn't know if I could forgive. I didn't know if it was possible. The pain was too great. The suffering was too great. My sense of loss was too great. And she said it took years. She moved into the village. She moved into the new home, but she says it took years. I carried so much anger and bitterness in my heart, which of course she did, right? And she said, she was a woman of deep faith, and she says it was God who healed my heart. It was God who gave me the power to forgive. And she says, I have forgiven. She says it was not easy. It didn't happen immediately, but it happened. And then sitting next to her was a man who told his story. He didn't give us all the details, but he said, he served an 8-year prison sentence, which what that signifies to everybody is that he killed a lot of people. This was not a low-level perpetrator. He had a lot of blood on his hands. And so he went and served his 8-year sentence. And as he was preparing to leave prison, they gave him the opportunity, they gave him the offer to live in this reconciliation village. And he said he really struggled with whether or not to do so. He says, and for him, it was the opposite of Cecile. He says, I don't know if I can be forgiven. I don't know. What I did was so horrific. I mean, he had come to be truly penitent. He says, but what I've done, you can't make it up. I can't, he says, I don't know if I can live among these people. I don't know if they can forgive me or if they'll just hate me forever. But in some ways he doesn't have any other choices, but this was an act of faith on his part as well. So he decided to go and move into this reconciliation village. And he says that was not easy. There was a lot of suspicion. There was a lot of, it was very difficult. But here they are now, this is now 30 years later, and they were sitting side by side, practically arm in arm. They were joking with one another. They were, you could tell that these two people who lived in this village together have a deep and genuine friendship. This isn't just toleration. This isn't just deciding not to kill each other in vengeance, right? This is a deep, and you can't fake it, right? I mean, you could tell that they were genuinely friends. And that was just absolutely remarkable for me to see. Like I can imagine forgiving the loss of your property, right? I can imagine that, but the loss of everything, your entire family, and then on his end, learning to live with this and deal with this and accept himself, to forgive himself on one level enough to be able to be in community. And then I'll just say one other place we went to. It was great. We traveled around the entire country. We met with people all the way from the UN High Commission for Refugees to national leaders and NGOs, and all the way down to very local NGOs. And one that we visited in the far west of the country was a woman. So one of the big problems during the genocide, in addition to all the death, was that the Hutus used sexual assault and rape as an instrument of genocide. It was actually after that the UN declared rape as a means of genocide. It wasn't part of international law before that, but it was so systematic and so intentional that now it has been added. And so there were, so even among the survivors, let alone among those who were killed, but among the survivors, there are hundreds of thousands of rape victims. And so the government has done a good job meeting people's material needs, again, with these kinds of villages and homes and so forth. But part of it is traditional African culture. Part of it is just the resources. They've not had the wherewithal to meet people's mental and emotional health needs. And so these rape survivors, again, some of them got homes and so forth, but they've had almost nobody attending to their trauma, to the deep trauma. And they're still in the culture, even though everybody recognizes what happened, there's still a sense of shame surrounding a sexual assault. And so these women, in a lot of ways, and this was in a very rural community, a long ways from the capital, they were thrilled to see us. Like, in the capital, they see Americans a lot. In some of these rural areas, they never see Americans. So they were like so happy to see us. And we went, and this incredible woman, Mama Emilienne, she rebuilt her home. She lost everything. She was a rape survivor. She lost her husband and children. So she was just another one of these survivors, lost everything. But then she rebuilt her life, rebuilt her home, and then said, I need to do something for other women like me. And so she just opened her home and created this organization from scratch for other women who were rape survivors to come and tell their stories, to be with one another, just in community. And so they were so gracious. They invited us in, and we went and sat on the floor together, and they went around and shared their stories, these women. Just horrific story. And a lot of them didn't get into graphic detail, but to talk about it and to talk openly about what they had suffered as rape survivors. And they talked about the ongoing mental and emotional trauma that comes with that. And it was just so gracious of them to kind of invite us into their space to share this. But you could tell that there was a lot of healing happening there, just among these women providing support for each other. Just again, no mental health professionals. There wasn't a PhD among them, right? There wasn't a professional licensed social worker among them. It was just women giving each other support in community and doing it over the space of many, many years. And you could see that it had been transformative. It had been healing. And so just so many, and I could share other examples as well, but just in the interest of time, I'll stop here. You know, my kind of takeaway from this, I had never been, I haven't been to Auschwitz and Dachau and some of those. I've been to Holocaust museums, but not some of those places where it actually happened. I had been, you know, shortly after today is 9/11. About a year later, I went to Ground Zero and saw still all the notes on the walls to memorials to the fallen. And I felt this sense of pain, a palpable, tangible sense of pain and loss in that place. I mean, it was haunted, I think, by those ghosts of people who had been killed there. And in Rwanda, I experienced that times 1,000. It's impossible to put into words what I saw, what I felt, what I witnessed. Just sobbed, ugly, gasping tears in some of those places. But it seemed to me that so there was this darkness and really encountering evil face to face, true evil. But then encountering all of this love and forgiveness and joy and reconciliation. Every group that we went to, it was fun traveling with undergraduate students because they're so fun and they have so much energy and they're so great. Like every place we went to turned into a dance party. And there was so much dancing and there was just joy and there was smiles. And even in these places, in some of these groups, where we were talking about hard things like rape and victimhood and all these kinds of things, but there was, and it just seemed to me, I don't know how this works in the moral calculus of the universe, but at least what I saw was that there seemed to be for as deep of a hole, for as deep of a kind of moral deficit that there was, for a lack of any better word, in the genocide, that there had been given that amount of grace and then some to make up for it. Of course, it doesn't erase it. It doesn't take it away. It doesn't take away the pain. It's still there. It's palpable. It affects everything. But time didn't stop with the genocide. Time kept going, and they rebuilt their lives. They're rebuilding their lives. They like. Sometimes I think we wonder if like forgiveness is really possible, if reconciliation is really possible. And at least what I saw, that in time after time after time, and it's not to say that it's easy or that there's any simple answers or simple paths. Again, they said it took years and years and years, but it's possible. Like it was real. And so it left me with a lot of hope. And there was a kind of, for as much death and suffering as there was, I also saw a lot of resurrection happening as well. Resurrection of hope, a resurrection of love, a resurrection of joy, a resurrection of community. And it was one of the most moving, transformative things I've ever experienced on both sides. And so I'll just leave it at that. Sorry if I went a bit long. I'm happy to just chat about whatever you all want to chat about.
Oh, no, you're good. I actually, I feel like to leave just a moment of space for a few seconds just to allow everybody to kind of digest that story. I know it's time crunch, but you just sit for a few seconds. I know most people aren't used to silence, but for me, just to sit with that story for a moment and think, and then maybe we can jump into questions people have. So maybe kind of just take a moment to compose and think about it for a few seconds, and even about what you may want to ask. Okay, so I think I think you answered a lot of the questions that I think we originally sent to you in terms of institution. What did the institution do? What did the community do? How did people work through the reconciliation? Was there any questions about that anybody else had, or anything else? I'd say we have maybe 15 minutes. So any thoughts? So yeah, Lasonia here is asking how many of the perpetrators were young people. Did they have a huge role in the genocide?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. I mean, basically everybody, I mean, and this is part of the tragedy, is the violence infected the entire population on both sides. So, I mean, if you were old enough to carry a machete, you were enlisted. And it was a typical pattern that we've seen in other places too. Even people who were hesitant, they were forced to, or else they would die, and then it becomes mass culpability, right? The idea is if everybody's guilty, nobody is. So young people were involved, which means there's a lot of lingering trauma there. The other thing I should say is one of the NGOs we went to, that was actually started a few years ago by a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, one of the first members of the church in the country after the genocide. He realized there were all these children who were orphaned by the genocide, right? And many of them were homeless. They lived on the street. Basically, this entire generation of street children who were then lived without parents. And I knew that, but I hadn't done the next step intellectually to say, oh, wait, those kids grew up. And 30 years later, those kids have now become adults and they've had children. And so that's what this guy had noticed, is now these children who were orphaned by the genocide, grew up without parents. Now they have children and they have no idea how to be parents. Many of them are still homeless. Many of them still don't have jobs. Many of them were never educated. So he's created this incredible NGO. It's called Empowering the Future, in which they take in the current generation of street kids and they provide free education to them and free meals. But what they do is then reunite them with their parents and then bring the parents in, and the parents get parenting classes, they get family life classes, and then they're trained in a trade. For women, it's either sewing or weaving, which are kind of traditional trades. For men, woodworking. And they go through a multiple month program and they get a certificate at the end. If they go through the entire program, the women are given a sewing machine, which were actually purchased by the church. So that was the church's donation. Or the men are given wood and enough money to set up. They're given a down payment for a home. And the whole idea is actually to recreate family and reunite and reconcile families. So they said, we knew if we only went after the kids, right, we would just keep having the same cycle of intergenerational trauma. And so they said, we need to address the entire family system and the entire family unit, including these kids who were orphans of the genocide. It's just incredible to see. So, there's ongoing issues there with the youth who were on both sides of the genocide.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, Carolyn, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience, Patrick.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the Catholic Church's role in leading up to the genocide and their role in reconciliation. How have they been involved?
Yeah, as a fellow Christian, this was one of the hardest things for me to see. So Rwanda was the most Catholic country. It was the most Christianized country in all of Africa by 1994. But it became apparent that Christianization was a mile wide and an inch deep. That it was a colonial church. There was very little moral and ethical formation that came along with that. And that many of the priests who were themselves Hutus, they got wrapped up into Hutu power. And so they sort of politics and ethnicity became more important than any of their religious commitments. And there's horrific stories about what happened in churches. One priest, for instance, who was a Hutu, the majority of his parishioners were Tutsis. They fled to the church for sanctuary. He locked them in the church and then ordered bulldozers to come and knock down the church on top of them. And 2,000 of his own parishioners. These are the people that he gave the Eucharist to every week. And so, unfortunately, the Catholic Church did very little to stem the tide of violence, and in some ways contributed to it. And other churches as well. There's stories of Adventists. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is very strong there, and Adventist ministers were implicated. Nobody's hands were clean, kind of institutionally, and no church stepped up prophetically to stop it. There are a few cases of individual heroic stories, as there always are, but institutionally the church did. Just the cycle of violence overtook the church as well. Since then, the Catholic Church and other churches have been participants in the reconciliation process, but they also know that they lost a lot of moral authority at that point. So over the past 30 years, they have been working to reclaim and rebuild that authority. It's still a very Christian country. So people didn't lose their faith in God, but they lost trust in some of the institutions. So 30 years later, still it's a heavily Christian country, still majority Catholic. Lots of other churches have come in as well. And they've participated in their own ways. Catholic Relief Services does great work in the country. Some of the other groups do great work. But yeah, it took a long time to rebuild some of that trust after 94.
Okay, Dana, I think you were next.
I'm always looking for ways to apply the healing lessons we learn elsewhere, to our own and to our own church. Certainly the genocide, the nature of it is so far different. It seems like, well, anyway, but generational trauma is still a real thing. And I'm impressed by the two principles that I kind of pulled out was addressing the whole family here and now, not just the youth, to break it down with elderly people and older. Yeah. And then the other thing was the healing in community. We often think, oh, that's, for professionals to do, which I don't knock professionals at all, but we've certainly seen, actually, Rachel and I, in watching some women come together from generational poverty, coming together in groups to just talk. And how they support each other. I'm wondering, applying those to, first of all, I don't know that we see the generational trauma in our own church that we come up against. And then the next thing is how to address it. It seems like we have the formula, but we maybe need to see it, too. So just wondering your thoughts on that. Anything that came to your mind that could be applicable, that you took from there, that you think could be applicable to the work to do?
Yeah. Great insights, great questions. And I would echo both of those. I actually think that we have some structures in the church that we could mobilize around these kinds of issues. I mean, this is what Relief Society is for. This is what a quorum is meant to be, right? We talk about these things. If anything, I fear that we've thinned out our local communities too much. That's one of my biggest fears of the contemporary church, is their communities are too thin. But this is exactly like, these are the structures that God has inspired for us to come together as men and women in local communities and to mourn with those who mourn and comfort those that stand in need of comfort. It's one thing to do that on an individual level, but we're placed in community because there's something really powerful about doing that. And of course, it doesn't, some of the kinds of issues, with racial reconciliation, other things, they might cross beyond and transcend particular ward boundaries. But we can still use that model of a Relief Society coming together, right, of sisterhood, and of brotherhood. And of course, it doesn't have to be gender separated, but sometimes it's actually useful to be separated by gender, because the experiences of men and women are different, even around some of these racial issues. So I think we can apply those models, what we already have in the church. And then I do think that, intergenerational trauma is absolutely real. And we have theologies and structures to think about the way that we keep faith with our ancestors, the way that we build peace across the generations. So one of the great revelations to Joseph Smith on peace is section 98. That's where he says, renounce war and proclaim peace. And actually, let me pull it up real quick. It's super interesting. Even those who do peace work within the church sometimes forget what comes next. So it's section 98, verse 16. Therefore, renounce war and proclaim peace, and seek diligently to turn the hearts of the children to their fathers and the hearts of the fathers to the children. That you cannot have peace and peace building and reconciliation unless you have an intergenerational lens, unless you heal the divides across the generations. And actually the whole rest of the section talks about the intergenerational effects of violence and conflict on the one hand, but peace building on the other hand, right? That these things redound to the generations, and we can reach back into those generations that came before us. So I think we've totally missed this, right? This is God's blueprint for peace building in the latter days, and he insists that this is a multi-generational, transgenerational project that we have to be a part of.
When you said you fear that we've thinned out, can you explain that? I don't know what you mean by that.
I just think about the thickness of relationships in Latter-day Saint wards, even when I grew up, let alone a generation before that, right? I mean, the road shows and all that kind of, right? And some of it was silly and campy, and sometimes some of it was too much, and it stretched us, right? So there were, community isn't always positive all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even, and I understood, I sustain my leaders and sustain the revelation behind it, but there's always unintended costs. And so I think one of the unintended costs of going from 3-hour church to 2-hour church is that we're with each other a third less, right? And face-to-face time matters. That wasn't always great time together. Sometimes we were just bored sitting in class together, right? But we were together. And some of the interactions that happened in the hall, I actually think that my experience is that the biggest loss from 3-hour church to 2-hour church is the loss of what I call hall church, right? You skipped second hour because you were kind of bored and you didn't want to go to Sunday school. So you stayed in the hall and talked to people. And actually some of my best relationships in the ward came because of hall church. Right. And that doesn't happen anymore. And we're doing fewer activities together, again, with the emphasis on the families, not overburdening families. I get all that, and they're good reasons. But the unintended consequence is that even at the ward level, our relationships, I think, are not as thick as they used to be a generation or two ago. So we need to be intentional about how are we going to, within the current structure that we have, okay, so let's keep 2-hour church, let's not overburden families, but what are meaningful ways that we can build and rebuild community? It might not be everybody, right? It might just be groups of people within a ward, might be people across wards. We have to be creative about it. We have to be anxiously engaged, but I think community is one of the great gifts that the Latter-day Saint community has. I think it's one of the things God has called us to, and for us to lose it or just let it slip away would really be letting go of one of the great gifts that God has called us to.
I think sorry, Dana, did you have something?
No, I was just going to say, I've certainly felt, and that's one of the things I've longed for. I grew up with road shows and hall church and all that. And we now have ministering where it's not relegated every month to do it. So thank you. Thank you.
So I think, LaSonia, that kind of speaks to your comment that community is missing, and I know you felt that, so it's real. And I actually think that's one of the challenges if we're talking about reconciliation, that is one of the challenges that we sit with, that we aren't even able to be friends with each other in some ways, right? So sorry guys, I feel like we could probably talk for a long time. Yeah, I know. So Marion, if you want to ask your question, and then maybe we'll wrap up a little bit. And
okay.
Yeah.
Actually, my question was very similar to Dana's, so she's kind of covered what my interest was. I just want to focus down on two very specific questions. I am so captivated by this, what you told us about community. That is beautiful. That's amazing. I think that's something our little group here has discovered. We came into this thinking, as Brigham Young descendants, we were going to take this big thing and change the world and fix it and heal, and learned very quickly that was a mistake. So we've kind of hunkered down into a smaller project, these smaller groups, smaller things. My question for you, two things. What, very specifically, what could a USU student, freshman student, who is interested, who's piqued interest at our dinner, what can they do right now for reconciliation? That's my first question.
Okay.
Second question, after you've been through all of this, what you've seen of our group, what suggestion do you have for us as Brigham Young descendants and our friends who support us? What can we do?
Yeah. I've got a really good answer to the first question. We'll see about the second. On the first one, and by the way, in the chat, I just posted a link to an essay I wrote and published about my experiences in Rwanda. Some of you may have seen it, others maybe not, but it's kind of some theological reflections on what I saw and experienced there that you might want to read. Yeah, for USU students, we have just created over the past couple of years a new Peace Institute. It's called the Harave Peace Institute. And it's an amazing group of faculty who are teaching a whole range of classes. We've just brought on a new faculty member named Chad Ford, who had built the peace building program at BYU Hawaii for the past 20 years and is a highly skilled international mediator and facilitator and so forth. And so we have a whole bunch of classes that the students can take. We have, for a freshman student, so just taking that, we have an intro to peace building class that they can take. We have a whole series of classes on communication and conflict, culminating in a program that we call Space Makers here. With Space Makers, it's really focused on inner peace and interpersonal conflict. So how do you develop communication skills to better communicate across difference? And that's an extraordinarily popular and effective program at the undergraduate level. There's lots of things that you can go on. You can get graduate programs in mediation and all that kind of stuff. But at the undergraduate level, it's actually pretty remarkable what this program does in terms of taking students within the course of they can get a lot just in one semester, but if they stick with it, there's a sequence of courses over 2 or 3 semesters. They come out highly, highly skilled around conflict and communication. It's just phenomenal. In terms of your group, I think what you just mentioned, Marion, is really important in terms of a certain kind. I think peacemakers have to cultivate a handful of character traits. One of them is humility. Because there can be a kind of grandiosity about what we want to do, but that we run pretty quickly up against other people's experiences and agency, right? And our own shortcomings. And so humility is really important. Patience and perseverance are incredibly important. Are we in it for the long game, or do we just want kind of short, flashy wins? Are we marathon runners? Or are we sprinters? Are we slow cooking a good Sunday dinner, or are we throwing in a microwave meal? We live in a microwave culture, and I think peacemaking, some of that can be useful, but peacemaking is slow cooking. And then I think the other, there's many other characteristics, but I think the other attribute to really nurture, it's 2 other things. One is hope, to never let go of hope. And Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. To believe that the universe is on the side of peace and reconciliation and healing, and we want to be agents of that. And then I think the last thing that I would say is to cultivate individually and collectively to become people of peace. It's especially in our Latter-day Saint culture, we talk a lot about doing things a lot. We are doers. We are Nephis. We are go and do people, right? We are beehive people. That is phenomenal. That is great. But sometimes we don't pay enough attention to cultivating the inner life, and what I've seen, even recently in some examples, I just, because of time, I won't share them, but even people with excellent skills in peacemaking are pretty limited in what they can do if they don't cultivate the inner peace to become a person of peace. And so this becomes, practices of I really like the writings of Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, who wrote extensively about this. Thomas Merton, in our own tradition, Thomas McConkie, I think is excellent. But doing the kind of inner work, the transformative work to become a person of peace in the world. And that is slow work. And it's not flashy, it's not visible, but I also think it's indispensable. And it can be done individually, it can be done collectively, but to continue to cultivate that inner peace. Wow. And that's not to set aside the activist sensibility, but they go hand in hand. I'll just let you know, very last thing, I have a podcast called Proclaim Peace that I co-host with Jennifer Walker Thomas. She's the co-executive director of Mormon Women for Ethical Government. And the episode that we just dropped yesterday was with Thomas McConkie, and it was all about cultivating and finding inner peace. And so we talked about the kind of Mary Martha dilemma, right? Mm-hmm. The contemplative versus the activist, and how do we do both? So that might be worth listening to as well, to think about some of these things. And actually, our guests on that entire podcast are terrific. So there might be some things that you can pick up listening to that podcast as well. But you guys are doing amazing work. I love your heart. I love what you're doing and what you're all about. So,
thank you.
Thank you. We've definitely had our ups and downs. So we appreciate you coming to talk to us and share with us that. That was beautiful. I appreciate the hope that you bring and the faith that you bring to this, because I think that does help us see a little bit better and have a little bit more hope in what we're trying to do. So thank you very much for taking your time. Thank you everybody who could be here. I was really happy to see our larger group. And so that was lovely. And I just appreciate everybody so much here. I don't even have words for how much gratitude I have for the people who are working in this space. So thank you all. And yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you. We'll see you.
Good night.
Thanks.
Thank you for your work. Thank you.
See you all.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.